is the year of the dragon. It's also the year of the lingering music. Anyway, Year of the Dragon is significant because tonight marks the first of several programs we'll be doing this year that have a Chinese theme. Well, let's talk about tonight's program, tonight's author. Richard Frank, in a way, has come home tonight. He was born in Kansas, grew up in Leavenworth, and then St. Joseph. He went to Mizzou, and then somewhat after that, he went to Georgetown Law and graduated from there as well. In between, almost 4 years, he was in the Army, U.S. Army, including a tour of duty in Vietnam as a platoon leader with the 101st Airborne Division. So, unlike a lot of military historians whose only experience in combat is on the armchair, Richard actually knows what he's talking about. In fact, not only does he know what he's talking about, he has written 3 incredibly well-received books on World War II history, generally focused on some aspect of the Pacific Theater. These include Guadalcanal, the definitive account of the landmark battle, Downfall, the end of the Imperial Japanese Empire, and most recently a biography of General MacArthur. I should add that Downfall, a paperback version thereof, is for sale this evening, courtesy of our friends at Barnes & Noble. It's right outside there, and Richard will be signing books after his presentation. In addition to the topic, the general topic of the Pacific Theater, World War II, these books have a lot in common. First of all, they are all known for possessing truly riveting narratives. Second, a lot of them, they're all based on culling information from newly declassified documents. And in some, what tends to happen with the books that Richard Frank writes is that he produces comprehensive accounts that effectively demolish long-standing myths. Downfall, I should note, did this so well that it was awarded the Harry S. Truman Book Award in the year 2000. But what are we doing tonight? Tonight, the book isn't done yet, but I know Richard is working on it. Tonight, he examines the new scholarship in the first 5 years of China's War of Resistance against Japan. That would be 1937 to 1942. Once again, he has culled information from previously classified archives, both in the People's Republic of China as well as the Republic of China, Taiwan. What he's done here is really, really amazing. His research illuminates the war's devastating effects on and beyond the battlefields, but also compels a tremendous reevaluation of the roles of China in World War II, both the nationalists and the communists, as well as General Joseph W. Stilwell, who was the American commander in the China-Burma-India theater. I think it's going to be a great talk, and I'm really disappointed that I won't be able to hear most of it because my good friend, dear colleague, and everyone's favorite library director, Crosby Kemper III, was supposed to be here tonight and do this one because I was supposed to be at the Plaza branch where there's a little book discussion going on that my 12-year-old daughter is in attendance at. I promised I'd be there, so I'll be off to Plaza momentarily, but in the meantime, please welcome Richard Frank.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here back home. Home is a place, there's an American poet who described home as the place where when you go there, they have to take you in. I hope to achieve a little higher than that level of criteria. Before I start my main talk, I wanted to share with you what I think is an interesting sort of breakthrough in our historical understanding of the Asian-Pacific War. And let me explain to you how I got to this insight. Back about 1980, I was reading the standard biography of Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, by an author named Agawa. And when Agawa got to the point in the biography where Japan is about to plunge into this disastrous war, Admiral Yamamoto was not available for comment. So he turned to one of Yamamoto's colleagues, an admiral by the name of Inoue Shigeyoshi, and said, well, how did Japan make this horrifyingly bad decision? And Inoue, being a sound officer of the Imperial Japanese Navy, a Naval Academy graduate, of course, had an answer. And his answer was, well, quote, Japanese politicians and army men Both underestimated America's natural strength and the spiritual strength of its people, particularly its women. They had the childish notion that since women had such a powerful say there, it wouldn't be long before they started objecting to the war. You know, and I read that passage, and I sort of put my head back, and this thought immediately flitted to the back of my mind. You know, if they'd only read or seen Gone with the Wind, maybe this whole thing could have been avoided. Fast forward about 15 years, and I'm reading this book called The Pearl Harbor Papers, and there's this very penetrating essay by a Japanese naval officer from World War II who later was a historian in Japan. And he is ruminating on the whole Pacific War, and he comes to a section many pages into this essay, I might add, where he's talking about the Americans. And he says, quote, "We'd entertained a great error in the survey of the American racial character. We had thought we could easily tackle them, that a race steeped in material comfort, seemingly absorbed in a hunt for pleasure, was spiritually degenerate. It was too late when we discovered the Americans, the true Americans. They fought desperately, furiously, fanatically, insensible to danger, forgetful of self. The American that appeared in Gone with the Wind appeared again absolutely unchanged in the current war." And then, about 10 years ago, I'm reading a biography of Admiral Richard O'Kane, the famous American submarine commander, who after an illustrious combat career, his boat was sunk, he was captured. And in this biography, there's a passage that reads as follows as he speaks with the skipper of the ship that he was taken aboard. "The skipper returned to the captain in the evening and began a discussion with his prisoner guest. The conversation ranged from naval tactics to literature. The Japanese officer pulled down a copy of Gone with the Wind, which he called Went with the Breeze. He said that if officials of both nations had read this story of the Civil War, the Japanese and the U.S. might have avoided conflict." So who knew that Scarlett, Melanie, God help us, Aunt Pity Pat, could have prevented this entire unpleasantness or whatever here. But since this is my home turf, I wanted to share with you this startling insight. I haven't quite decided yet how it's going to be published, but I'll work on that. What I really want to talk about tonight, I call China's War of Resistance, also subtitle it sort of the lost years of World War II. In the year 2002, I was in an international academic conference. One of the topics that came up during that week was how the Asian Pacific, or the Pacific War, was taught at the high school level in Japan and the United States. One day, there was a table with a set of displayed in which there were a number of American history textbooks. I picked up one particular book and looked at it, and as history textbooks these days are so often want to do, there was a table on one page that said Axis nations that fought in World War II and their casualties, and it listed a list of the nations and the casualties, and it was a reasonable approximation. And sure enough, on another page, there was a table labeled Allied nations that participated in World War II and their losses. And my eye flitted over that list, and I immediately realized there was something that was wrong. And then when I looked again a second time more carefully, I realized they had entirely omitted from that table China. This is the China that, among all the, what were called the United Nations in World War II, fought the longest, 97 months, from July of 37 to August of 45. This is the China that sustained stupendous human loss. When I wrote Downfall, I used the then very conventional number that the Chinese, during the course of World War II, sustained a total of about 10 million deaths, about 3 or 4 million military. Since that time and working on it as I have now, I would not hesitate to go to 15 million. Historians who've worked this area that I respect will use a number of 20 million or more. In the People's Republic of China today, the official number from the government puts out, plus Chinese historians, will use numbers ranging from 30 to 35 million, which would be a number higher than the losses even in the Soviet Union, which are given now typically as 27 million. Absolutely stupendous numbers of deaths. And I should add that the military deaths in China are still normally given as 3 or 4 million. All the rest of those deaths in China are civilians, non-combatants. The reasons for this omission from this textbook, I think, are multiple. First of all, the fact is that we have, although we devoted approximately twice as much effort in the war against Hitler as against Japan, both the popular and the academic history that's published since World War II has skewed very heavily towards Europe by a factor of at least 4 to 1, perhaps higher. Further, from the American perspective, World War II begins with the attack on Pearl Harbor, and of course the Chinese have been fighting for 4.5 years before then, and this whole period is sort of in a big shadow at best. But above all these factors, I think, is a simple fact that there was a lack of the sort of primary material that historians could work with to generate histories in the last several decades. This changed when the fellow we call Chiang Kai-shek died in 1975, and then Mao Zedong died the following year in 1976. After a period of time, after a decade or so, archival information became available on both sides of the Formosa Strait. This material has been worked now by both Western and Chinese historians on both sides of that strait. They've published now a lot of new and insightful essays and books, which, I mean, I could say I mined. I would like to say I plundered to get material for this talk tonight. But what has struck me and everyone else I have talked to about this is it's really a remarkable revision and upgrade of our understanding on the level of that of which we've undergone with respect to what we call the Russian front, from, say, where we were in the 1970s to where we are now in terms of our understanding about what went on. If I had to characterize 2 fundamental features of this new history from this period, the first would be that on both sides of the Formosa Strait, and particularly strikingly within the People's Republic of China, the reputation, the towering image of Mao Zedong as the singular political and military genius who directed the Chinese Communists to victory has, to say the least, been subject to some revision. Even more startling, and believe me, it took me a while to believe that this was true, but after having worked through the material and talked to a set of Western historians and read essays by historians from the People's Republic of China, what we used to call Communist China, the fact is that today, as I speak, the fellow we call Chiang Kai-shek is now a pretty respected figure in the People's Republic of China, celebrated as a great nationalist, a great fighter against the Japanese. Perhaps if I were to give you an anecdotal piece of evidence as to how he stands now is since 1949, when the Chinese Communists succeeded in the Civil War, the most popular historical novel that's ever been published in the People's Republic of China, which was published in the 1980s, is about an incident during the war called the Wuhan incident. And in that novel, the most popular book, Chiang Kai-shek is either the wrong party or the hero. And for those of us, say over 40 or whatever, who are familiar with the history of China and Communist China, it's just startling to realize that something that would have been unthinkable 30 years ago now actually commonplace in the People's Republic of China. So this is what I'm going to talk about then today is a lot of what I think this new history shows. I've called out really only a small portion of what I think is striking or remarkable to talk about tonight. And I think to further frame this up, to bear in mind that the way that, particularly in this period I'm talking about, and I emphasize again, I'm talking about July of 37 to May of 42. I'm not talking about the period from May of 42 on to 45 when there are big problems in China, big problems for the nationalists in Shanghai, a surge, the Chinese communists at that time. I'm focusing on this earlier phase of the war, this long period of the war. And this is a period in which previously we had it depicted typically in American, both academic and popular history, that Chiang and the nationalists didn't want to fight. They had to be dragged kicking and screaming to the war, that they spent a good deal of the war trying to get other people to fight the Chinese communists, fight the Japanese, and keeping the best troops in reserve against the communists, that Chiang was an effective political and military leader, and so on and so forth. A degree of denigration of the efforts of both Chiang and the nationalists, and the related Chinese leaders who worked with Chiang during that period. A Chinese historian now in the People's Republic summed up a lot of that history, actually talking about the history that had been published in the People's Republic since 1949. This quote, partial in arguments, simplistic in its conclusions, and abundant in falsehoods, unquote. And I think to a large degree that now would how I would characterize what we previously had understood about what the war was like in China during this period and the role of Chiang the nationalists. I should emphasize that because I'm coming into this in the context of how Chiang has been depicted in the historiography that's been published here now in the last many decades or whatever here, that I'm going to basically challenge a lot of this stuff. I'm not here to tell you that Chiang Kai-shek was the second coming of Abraham Lincoln, that the nationalists were running the equivalent of Switzerland, that there were not very severe problems that beset the nationalists both during this period and after, and that were led to the ultimate triumph of the Chinese communists. But I would like to put now in context what these events really looked like at the time based on information that we have now. The first place to start is the notion that Chiang and the nationalists were not interested in fighting the Japanese. There's now abundant, I think, irrefutable evidence that from 1932 on, Chiang clearly set out with the vision that restoring Chinese sovereignty, which was not only his goal, but the whole goal of many Chinese leaders of that period, knew that that meant there had to be a war with Japan. There were numerous preparations that he had ordered and were conducted by his government from 1932 onward. One of the most important of these was conceiving a military strategy in which he believed the Chinese could take on the Japanese. And they came up with the notion that the only effective national strategy that China could follow, given the circumstances at that time, was that they would have to drag the Japanese into the interior, engage them in a long, protracted, exhausting war, and eventually prevail in that context. And Chiang said that he believed that once this war started, it would lead to a world war, that the world war would lead to international allies for China, and that China would emerge on the victorious side thanks to this sequence of events. In March 1934, he told a gathering of nationalist officials that the date that this war would begin was only 1,000 days off. This is off by 43 days from when the war actually began. So the notion that Chiang and the nationalists are not interested in fighting the Japanese and made no preparations, I think has been pretty thoroughly debunked by this new evidence. Now, when this war begins in July 1937, let's look at what the military situation was from the Chinese standpoint. First of all, the Chinese did not have any significant naval forces. They didn't have enough naval power to control smuggling, much less take on the Imperial Japanese Navy, which was the third greatest navy in the world. With respect to air power, although the Chinese had a fair number of aircraft, they were heavily dependent upon foreign supplies, had a very small nucleus of trained airmen, and therefore they were not in a position to really seriously challenge the Japanese. The only place where the Chinese could match up in some fashion with the Japanese was on the ground. And let's look at the Chinese armies in 1937. And I'm not going to bore you with a lot of slides, but this one I think is very important. What this shows is that overall the Chinese could muster about 2 million men under arms to face the Japanese. Of these 2 million men, however, the forces that actually were directly controlled by, loyal to Chiang Kai-shek, were only about 300,000. And of that number, only about 80,000 who had been trained and equipped by a German military mission were really on some level of par with the Japanese. They were by far the best, those 80,000 were by far the best trained and equipped Chinese troops available. Next to that were a series of regional armies under people that are sometimes referred to as warlords, who were people who actually were loyal and obedient to Chiang on a routine basis. That numbered about 600,000 men. And this group, in general, were better trained and armed than the other Chinese forces under arms. And then you come to almost half the total number of Chinese under arms in 1937. This number is about 1 million individuals. These individuals were all answerable to regional or warlord commanders. They were not well trained. They were not well armed. This number also includes, at that time, what were probably only about 20 to 30,000 individuals who were in the Chinese Red Army who actually had weapons. And finally, you had this small group of up to a 250,000 who were members of armies that had been in Manchuria or northeast China. These guys tended to melt away at the start of the war. Many of them became puppet troops and really became of no consequence in the war. So that's the order of battle of the Chinese armies taking on what at the start of the war was about 600,000 Japanese under arms. Now, this chart showing a military order of battle is very significant in another way, because what this also reflects is a very fundamental factor that got sloughed out of sight in a lot of the post-war reporting, and that's that this also reflects political power in China. That when the war began in July of 37, Chiang Kai-shek and his nationalist government really had a reasonably firm control over probably about a third of China's population, which was somewhere between 450, 480 million at that time. And his area of control was really towards the coastal areas, I should add. The remainder of the China still was under regional local political leaders. To be a political leader in China at that point in time meant you had to also have armed forces to back you up and to make you effective. So this chart you should also take to understand, to be some indication of what the political lineup was in China and what Chiang was dealing with as a leader, not as a military commander-in-chief who could simply issue orders and everyone would hop to. But you see that there's this tier of his authority, his power over the forces that China could deploy against Japan. Now, although the Japanese had only about 600,000 men, in terms of what military historians like to call their combat power, their effectiveness, that the totality of their ability to be effective on the battlefield, the Japanese were vastly superior, and for a number of reasons. First of which was cultural, that late dynasty China had deprecated the significance of soldiers and soldiering. There was a common Chinese phrase that went something close to, you don't take good iron to make nails, you don't take good men to make soldiers. So there was this fundamental cultural issue that Chiang and other Chinese leaders had to deal with. Secondly, the Japanese modernization process had begun and moved much more effectively forward than the Chinese version. One aspect of that was that there was an extraordinarily tiny number of Chinese who had even a high school level education or a college level. These are the people that you would draw upon for officers to man your armies. The Chinese were at a tremendous disadvantage at this level. The Japanese not only had a higher overall educational system, they had military academies, they had staff colleges that turned out year after year after year cadres of well-trained officers, staff officers. Above the level of company command in the Chinese army, there was an enormous lack of talent. That lack of talent translated into an ability to effectively observe a battle, determine what to do, and distribute and coordinate orders and forces or whatever here, which was one of the reasons why, despite this enormous mass of Chinese soldiers, they were not able to match up with the Japanese. And of course, the Japanese, as part of this modernization process, had also succeeded in manufacturing lots of equipment to outfit their forces with, such that their firepower at every level was typically vastly greater than what the Chinese armies and units could bring to bear. There was an American military observer who said that basically every Japanese unit was somewhere between 3 and 12 times more effective than its Chinese equivalent. The Japanese went by a saying that basically, as a rule of thumb, that a Japanese infantry regiment alone could take on one of the very best of Chiang's, this very small number of very best trained and equipped Chinese units, could take them on and beat them. A Japanese battalion-sized unit, say 600 or 700 men, could take on a Japanese division and expect to win. This was the sort of disparity of combat effectiveness that the Chinese were wrestling with in dealing with the Japanese. Now, when the war begins, it begins around Beijing, around the Marco Polo Bridge. It rapidly escalates because of decisions primarily on the Japanese side Chiang does not, and the other Chinese do not initiate fighting around the Marco Polo Bridge with thoughts towards moving to a general war. That decision is basically made in Tokyo. It's made fundamentally on the notion that a century of experience in dealing with the Chinese and fighting the Chinese has taught the Japanese and other outside powers that basically the Chinese will fold up after a very brief period of time, seldom more than a year. So the Japanese enter the war believing that all they have to do is come in and succeed in a battle or two, and the Chinese are going to fold up. Chiang looks at the situation, realizes that this is going to be the big war, and assesses what he needs to do. He realizes that although the war has begun effectively in the northern part of China, that area of China is dominated by regional commanders who are not loyal and whose forces are not well trained. And also the terrain in northern China does not favor the Chinese. It favors, in fact, overwhelmingly the Japanese. Chiang decides that the first place where he wants to make a major fight is at Shanghai, right here. Shanghai is by far the premier city of China at that time, at least in terms of industry, commercial activity, trade. It also contains a large Western contingent of both commercial and also, importantly, diplomatic, and also, importantly, journalists. One theory is that Chiang fought there because he thought this was going to immediately bring the Western powers or outside powers into the war. The recent scholarship seems to pretty clearly reflect it, although in the long run, that's what he thought was going to happen in the war. This was not what he was expecting when he fought at Shanghai. He fought at Shanghai basically because he reasoned that the one place where China's masses of infantry and light weapons could be effective was in a large urban setting, where the Japanese advantages of firepower, mobility, and all this command and control could be negated by fighting street to street, house to house. And also the terrain around Shanghai but also, was also cut up in such a fashion that Japanese could not exploit all the normal advantages they had. So an enormous battle begins in Shanghai really in August of 1937. And when this battle begins, the Japanese, and indeed the entire world, believes that once the Japanese get some significant forces into Shanghai, they're basically going to rout the Chinese, and probably the war is going to end very shortly. Well, days become weeks, weeks become months. There is an enormous battle going on in Shanghai. Before it's over, the Chinese have committed 750,000 troops, including a large chunk of Chiang's best forces. Before it's over, the Japanese are going to commit 250,000 troops. This is, prior to the Battle of Stalingrad in 1942, by far the largest battle fought actually within a city in World War II. And as the combat goes on day after day, week after week, the Japanese become increasingly frustrated and increasingly embarrassed about why this is going on when it's expected that they are going to basically rout the Chinese forthwith. In fact, this leads to a classic example of interesting spin, quoted from the New York Times, a reporter talking to a Japanese officer, and the reporter sends the dispatch back to Washington, which reads as follows, quote, "In explanation of the slowness of their progress around Shanghai, the Japanese complained that the Chinese, ignorant of tactics, did not know when to retreat." Well, as Chiang later admits, he makes a big mistake, and he keeps the battle going on longer than he should have. The Japanese bring up large numbers of reinforcements. They land behind Shanghai, and in the end, the Chinese are going to be driven from Shanghai. In this enormous battle in Shanghai, the Chinese will lose what's estimated to be about 170,000 men killed and wounded. The Japanese are going to lose about 40,000 total killed and wounded. The numbers of dead, however, about 10,000, and in fact, for some of the early committed Japanese units, the level of casualties are astonishing. The 9th Division, which they send early on, by the end of the campaign, by a numerical count, has sustained losses equivalent to 94% of the division's original strength. Once the Japanese do win at Shanghai, in Tokyo there is some sense about containing the war. In the field, however, there is no sense of containing the war. There's a sense that now Since the Chinese did not immediately capitulate after Shanghai, the thing to do is to drive on to Nanjing, which is just up the Yangtze from Shanghai, and which is the capital of the Shang's nationalist government at that time. When the Japanese field commanders, who basically are the ones who are going to force this strategy upon Tokyo, when they launch their forces towards Shanghai, they do so without providing their soldiers with food, or extraordinarily minimal levels. Japanese soldiers are required to basically loot from the countryside, loot from the Chinese population in order to survive. This is obviously a sure prescription for incredible levels of savagery and depredations against the civilian population. The Japanese get to Nanjing in December 1937, and there takes place what's usually referred to as the Rape of Nanjing. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. There is a Chinese memorial to what happened at Nanjing, and on that memorial is literally carved in stone the figure of 300,000 dead in Nanjing. There was an international bestseller by Iris Chang called The Rape of Nanjing, which used numbers in the 300 to 400,000 range for dead. Since that time, there's been a lot of work on this issue by Western historians, and after going through this, my view is that, as one put it, you can come up with some reasonable argument using Western standards and what information we have, and get numbers between 40,000 and 200,000. You probably can't go above that number reasonably. I would further argue, and I will argue in what I'm going to publish, that one of the problems with this emphasis on Nanjing is it became such a symbol of what was going on that in many ways it obscured the fact that what's going on there is something that's being replicated to one degree or to another all over China, that the total number of Chinese deaths that are going to occur are just this absolutely incredible number. Its effect on China I'm going to come back to in a while, but just bear in mind that Nanjing probably is not exactly the way Iris Chang presented it. The Japanese then proceed to make two huge strategic errors. The first of which was driving on to Nanjing and what they do in Nanjing, which basically fortifies the resolution of the Chinese people to continue the war. The second mistake they made is when Chiang refuses to capitulate to their demands in December of 1937. In January 1938, the Japanese announced that they're no longer going to treat Chiang Kai-shek as the legitimate government of Japan. This would be all well and good if you think everything is going to sort of fold up and work your way. However, if it's not, and later you're going to be looking for a negotiating partner, you've just announced that the leader of the Chinese people is not an acceptable negotiating partner, which leaves you in a rather difficult position, doesn't it? But the Japanese begin the year of 1938 still supremely confident that with one more great victory in the field, or a couple of victories in the field, that surely the Chinese will fold up, just as they have done consistently for the last basically a century. And so they decide to drive on towards the next obvious target, which is the Wuhan city. This is the Yangtze River, which moves up. Wuhan, a tri-city area, is the most well-known of which is Hankow. And that's where Chiang has displaced his military headquarters and a large part of his government. 1938 is an absolutely critical year in what's going to happen in China's war of resistance. As I indicated, the Japanese enter the year, as do almost all foreign observers, believing that surely the Chinese are going to fold up, if not immediately, then in a very short period of time. Chiang meets with his senior other military leaders, and they resolve to fight on. Interestingly enough, although our State Department, the military attaché detachment led by Joseph Stilwell, are all reporting their expectation the Chinese are going to fold up, President Roosevelt gets a different view from the commander of the Asiatic Fleet, Admiral Harry Yarnell. Admiral Yarnell says that so far in the war he's been shocked by the level of savagery that the Japanese have exhibited, that before the war is over, he says, literally, he tells Roosevelt, millions are going to die. He says, but the Chinese will not quit. And Yarnell is correct. He correctly captures what's going to happen in terms of this war. Now, as an aside, I'd like to tell you a story about one of my colleagues for years talked about writing a biography of Harry Yarnell, who is a very interesting character who had an important formative role in the U.S. Navy. He never got the biography completed, but I tell you what, he had a killer title. His title was Up the Yangtze with Yarnell. Now, By March of 1938, the Chinese have rallied, are offering much stiffer resistance than in April. They achieve an important victory at a place called Taizhizhuang, where in a railway junction, the Japanese, two divisions maneuvering very recklessly, the Chinese are able to mass against both of them and force them back. The victory has not only significant military significance, but great political significance. It's a sign the Chinese are not going to quit. It's relayed to Washington, and it's a very important factor in President Roosevelt's decision that he is ultimately, by the end of the year, is going to be supporting the Chinese. Nonetheless, as the summer goes on, the Japanese are driving on Wuhan, and they're driving both up to Yangtze and a little bit to the north with another column. That column, after the battles in April and May, breaks through, and Chiang Kai-shek faces one of the most terrible decisions and dilemmas he's going to face during the war. Chinese armies to the north of the Wuhan cities have been defeated and are in retreat. He's deeply alarmed, as are his other subordinates, that the Japanese are going to break through. At the urging of his subordinates, he makes a terrible decision to breach the dikes of the Yellow River, which this is done in June. The Yellow River at that point is basically above the plain area. Above the dikes hold the river intact. Below the dikes are in fact the land. There is a stupendous flood which flows across a large swath of China. In that flood, it's believed somewhere between 500,000 and 900,000 Chinese died. As one historian who's worked this area, Diana Lowry, points out, it's unthinkable that an event of this magnitude, which she says is the greatest ecological disaster during World War II, could have occurred anywhere in the West, and it could have passed so entirely unnoted as it has been in Western historiography about the war in China. But that is the fact. The Japanese drive on to Wuhan. During that, it's now pretty clear that what enables them to keep advancing at various important critical points is they use poison gas against the Japanese on a number of occasions. Now, the Chinese also, they have their finer moments and they have their less so fine moments during this campaign. There are instances in which Chinese commanders are extremely ineffective and are routed. There are other instances in which Chinese commanders make incredibly resolute stands and make the Japanese pay plenty for their advance. But by the end of October 1938, the Japanese have in fact seized Wuhan. Now, on the one hand, it looks like the Japanese have achieved their objective, but remember that their overall political objective remained to drive China out of the war. And still at the end of October 1938, Chiang, his government, the Chinese people are still saying, no, we're not going to quit. And at that point, in Tokyo, at the highest levels of the Imperial Japanese Army, there now comes the recognition that what appeared to be a war that would end swiftly at the beginning of 1938 is now a war that they concede cannot be decided by military means alone at the end of 1938. Now, I've emphasized the military campaigns in 1937, 1938, but something else is going on during this period. The Japanese, in addition to overrunning North China and seizing Shanghai and driving up to Yangtze, basically have occupied all the important ports along the Chinese coast, and various places have driven in some distance. The pre-war population of China, as I indicated, is variously put at somewhere between 450 and 480 million. I'm not sure how many Chinese were living in this area that had been overrun by the Japanese by this point, but it was maybe a quarter, a third or so of the total Chinese population. This area of China along the coast, Shanghai and whatever here, was not only an area that was important for commerce, it was also the intellectual center, or most of the intellectual centers of China at that time. It was to a vastly disproportionate extent, important to Chinese industry and commerce. As the Japanese overran this area, stories about what Japanese occupation meant, typically that any woman will be abused or raped, that males of military age were frequently summarily executed, drove an enormous flight of refugees, what's been called the greatest human migration in history. Various numbers have been placed upon the number of refugees that will flee various parts of China during World War II. A recent scholarly account that I think is probably about as sound as any in trying to grapple with this very difficult problem says the number is like 45 million, which is an almost unimaginable number for any of us to try to grapple around. I should point out that also, in addition to being the intellectual center of China, this is like most of Chinese colleges and universities literally have to pick up and move to the interior. Now, China had known enormous upheavals over its some 4,000-year history by that point. During the Taiping Rebellion, which occurred roughly coincident with the American Civil War, it's estimated that as many as 30 million people died, that there were big swaths of China that were affected by the fighting. But nonetheless, this period in 37, 38, the expanse of China that's involved is more than has ever occurred before. In fact, there's a quote from a Chinese paper that calls this the first war of the entire nation in Chinese history. In comparison, all these preceding wars were merely partial wars, that this war has engulfed all of China. And part of this evacuation process is that it strikes a blow at the heart of Chinese social structure and families. The family, the multi-thousand-year history of China at this point evolved to what's standard and ideal, as they put it, four generations living under one roof. That family then tied by clans to an immediate local community. When this mass migration takes place, these families face first the issue of do you take along the older folks? And from the numbers who eventually will come out at the end, it's clear that either they didn't start or they're left along the way. But what's even more horrific and well described by an American journalist named Frida Utley is the fact that families would start this horrendous trek not knowing at the beginning how long and how hard it was going to be and without sufficient food. And a family would start with as many as 5, 6 or more children, and after a period of time and exhaustion and without any food, they would begin abandoning children, such that a family by the end of the march might have only 1 or 2 children left after this march. This whole process, which was exemplified particularly in these first 2 years, but would affect China throughout the whole war, has led to something that two Western historians, Dinah Larry and Stephen McKinnon, have argued was of far more significance than what happened in 37, 38. What they argue is that essentially what this war did, because of its pervasive effect on Chinese society, was it struck a body blow at this 4,000-year-old society, that it atomized the Chinese to a degree that had never been done before, that it dislocated the family structure, the connections between Chinese, such that what's going to happen after 1949 with Mao is he's able to do what he does because of this basic disruption of the whole Chinese society that goes back to what is done by the Japanese during the Second World War, which shows you basically why what's going on here is of vastly more importance than we've given it credit or attention for. Now, by the beginning of 1939, the Japanese have altered their strategy. They realize they cannot simply win a victory in a military sense against the Chinese. They move to a two-tiered strategy, the first of which is to set up a rival or puppet or client government. And secondly, they move to attempt to consolidate their holdings in China, which are now vast, but in fact are so vast that the Japanese cannot effectively do more than hold what's called points and lines, which is to say they hold major cities, major urban locations. They attempt to keep clear lines of communications between those points. But elsewhere in the countryside, it's sort of a no man's land, particularly in this early phase where you have not only the Japanese, you have their puppet troops, but you have Chinese nationalist forces, various other Chinese forces, Chinese communist forces, all competing with sheer bandits in this sort of no man's land throughout China. The Chinese also have reached a point where a large part of what they had in terms of their built-up military armaments have been lost in the early years of the war. They don't have, because they've been cut off from outside supplies and have very limited industrial base, especially an industrial base evacuated inside. They don't have nearly as much armament to sustain a major continuous battle, although they continue to fight. And there's no doubt from both the Japanese accounts and the Chinese accounts that battles take place, although they're not on the same scale typically as Shanghai, Wuhan, or Nanjing. And the Chinese also, at this phase of the war, as building on their experience in 1938, begin to evolve tactics that actually permit them to achieve success against the Japanese. Basically, the Chinese insight into what they're dealing with is that the great weakness that the Japanese Imperial Army has is logistics. And that once a Japanese offensive begins, they simply load up their men with whatever those guys can actually carry. And after approximately a week to 10 days, they're out of food, they're low on ammunition and other stuff. And then, and only then, do the Chinese then begin to attempt to confront them, both frontally and on the flanks, and try to cut off whatever supply routes there. And with these tactics, the Chinese begin having some consistent successes, although still they have to have a very fortunate set of circumstances, skilled commanders, and some good luck on their side in order to achieve success. But they continue to fight, they continue to bleed the Japanese. As part of this revised strategy that the Japanese turned to after 1938, when they realized that they cannot win a war in conventional sense on the ground, they grasped the air weapon. Now, after World War I, there were a number of attempts to establish either legal or informal taboos against certain types of warfare. The classics of these were gas warfare, submarine warfare, and the aerial bombardment of cities. And as we all know now, of these, the only one that seemed to hold some sway through World War II was the use of poison gas on the battlefield, except in China. The Japanese in 1931 actually are the first nation to actually conduct a major urban bombing campaign in in 1932 in Shanghai, in a battle that takes place there. The Japanese, for the first time, engage in a major urban bombing effort directed specifically at terrorizing civilians. After the stalemate in China, the Japanese build up their air power, and then in 1940 and 1941, they launch what they call Operations 101 and 102. Both of these, using both Imperial Army and Imperial Navy bombers, are designed and bluntly designed in terms of the fact, as Ned Wilmot points out, the Japanese say directly in their operations order that the purpose of this is to terrorize the Chinese civilian population to such an extent that the Chinese government will surrender. The particular target of the major part of this effort is against, let me go back here, is against where Chiang has moved his major government. This city, which we called at that time Chongqing, is subjected to repeated bombing attacks. During those bombing attacks, the city is very heavily damaged, and in the course of the bombing campaign, particularly in the period between 40 and 41, something like 15,000 Chinese are killed in that city alone. By way of comparison, throughout the entirety of World War II, there were about 20,000 fatalities in the city of London. The Japanese do not succeed, obviously, in this campaign and what their purpose is. They do extract two interesting lessons from this that they're going to apply in the Pacific War. The first of which is that they realize they need to mass aircraft, particularly their fighter aircraft, and secondly, because of the range issues involved in trying to reach this far inland in China, the Japanese issue orders to aircraft manufacturers of new aircraft, including the famous Japanese Zero fighter, which is directly related to their air campaigns in China. Now, notice I haven't said too much about the Chinese communists at this point. Well, where are they? Well, when the war begins, as Diane Lowry and some other historians point out, they're very much isolated in the countryside. And contrary to some of the some of the historiography that's published in the last several decades, she argues that at that point in time, there was no real prospect of the Chinese communists being triumphant in a civil war. And in fact, when the war begins, Mao's direction of the Chinese Communist forces is not towards direct confrontation of the Imperial Japanese Army. It's towards expanding base areas for guerrilla operations in northwest China. Well, at the beginning of the war, the Chinese communists have like I said, something on the order of 20 to 30,000 men under arms. By 1940, they have raised their armed forces to something on the order of 500,000. In 1940, there is a report that a historian named J. Taylor found in Moscow, which was sort of what we've been up to report on behalf of the Chinese Communist Party, submitted by Zhou Enlai, who's later going to be the number 2 under Mao in the People's Republic, basically recounting what's going on in the war to date. And from the report, the time period he's talking about is from July of 37 to probably August or so of 1939, the first 2 years of the war. And in that report, Zhou Enlai says that the Chinese armed forces in toto have sustained about 1 million casualties. And of those 1 million casualties, the communist forces have sustained 31,000 killed and wounded, which by ordinary math would tell you that they have sustained about 3% of the total combat losses by Chinese forces in the first 2 years of the war, which would suggest, I would think, that the notion that the nationalists and other Chinese forces are not fighting the communists are needs to be rather substantially revised, certainly for that period of the war. In fact, the issue of how much weight the Chinese communists are carrying during this first period of the war will later lead Mao to finally authorize what's called the 100 Regiments Campaign in August of 1940. During this campaign, the Chinese communists launch a major offensive across the area that they dominate now in northwest China, primarily directed at puppet forces, communication centers, and achieved significant initial success. The Japanese, however, respond to this by moving forces from all over China into this area and launch an absolutely savage campaign that will later be called the 3-all campaign, burn all, kill all, loot all, in which they sweep across this area, basically inflicting a tremendous, devastating defeat, reversing all the successes that the Chinese communists have had, basically wiping out large base areas such that the Chinese communists are going to have to reduce the number of men they attempt to maintain under arms by about 100,000 during this period. There is a number of essays now saying that basically the notion also that Chiang Kai-shek kept his main and best forces facing the Chinese communists all the time simply won't stand up if you actually go through and crunch the numbers. Now, let me move on to the campaign in Burma in 1942, because if it's of enormous significance, and even more significance than it was recognized then or in a lot of the post-war history. By the end of 1941, the Japanese have essentially cut off the Chinese from all communications along the coast. They've also occupied northern Indochina, so nothing can come through Indochina and come up to the nationalists. The Soviets, after the Germans' attack in June of 1941, who had been providing what support, the main part of the support the Chinese had been receiving, have had to finally end what they'd already reduced after they signed a pact with Hitler in 1939. So the only connection that China now has with the outside world is through Burma and what's called the Burma Road, which is by no means a wonderful outlet at that time, but it has both physical and important psychological aspects, since it's the last tangible connection that China has with the outside world. Now, Burma is, in terms of its topography, is basically, you can call it a cul-de-sac or a blind alley. And that is to say, it's shaped sort of like a U with the open end pointing to the south to the Indian Ocean. And down at that end is the port of Rangoon, which is by far the most important position in Burma from a logistical standpoint. The eastern, northern, and western borders of Burma are all defined by very high mountain ranges. Part of them are the Himalayas. The communications from India into Burma or from Burma into China are very limited as a result of those mountains. So that holding Rangoon, obviously, is the key to holding Burma. Well, the Japanese basically defeat the much inferior British Commonwealth forces and seize Rangoon on the 8th of March. And this is about the 8th of March 1942, and this is about the time when General Joseph W. Stilwell had this meeting. Chiang Kai-shek says to Stilwell, look, first of all, the Japanese have absolute air and sea superiority here in Burma. So secondly, the British Commonwealth forces in Burma are now at a very low state. Most of them are actually Indian and Burmese units, not from the UK British units or whatever here. The British are also already thinking about retreating, and all of that happens to be true at that time. Chiang Kai-shek has sent to Burma his 5th and 6th armies, which are really roughly equivalent to a corps. As Chiang points out, these are literally the best units he has available in his entire army. And in fact, the only mechanized division he has in the entire Chinese army he sent to Burma. And Chiang says, obviously, he doesn't want to lose them. He said, and he also acknowledges that we cannot stand up man for man against the Japanese because of the superiority of the Japanese in firepower and all these other things. And Chiang says, therefore, in view of this set of circumstances, and he says, and oh, by the way, General Stilwell, I think your estimates of how many Japanese are in Burma are way low. And we now know that Chiang is right, that they're way low. So Chiang says, I think the best we can possibly accomplish at this point is to try to hold a line through the middle of Burma to maintain a land link between India and China so that in a better day, we will still be able to have a land connection between China and the outside world. Well, Stilwell takes command. It's a very complex story. It's a very sad story, at the end of which the Japanese have trounced the Commonwealth forces they encounter in Burma. They're going to defeat the Chinese forces that are there, although the Japanese, being pretty tough graders, make no qualms about the fact that by far and away, the toughest fighting that they had in Burma were against the Chinese units, which some Japanese officers say are fighting at the same level that they saw in Shanghai in 1937, the most effective Chinese fighting that they have seen in the entire war. It ends in a disastrous rout and defeat, and Stilwell walks out of Burma, very famously walks out of Burma, which becomes a much, much publicized event. And at the micro level, it's very impressive. He walks out with a party of a little over 100 men from where they have to abandon their vehicles over into India. He leads them out. He loses no one in that walkout, while there are tremendous losses in the other forces that are trying to get out of Burma at that time. This is well celebrated in America, and certainly anyone who's only read Tuckman and the Green Book, would have a very, and I should also add, there's a lot of admirable things about Joseph Stilwell individually that one can talk about, but let's look at it from the Chinese standpoint. From Chiang Kai-shek's standpoint, this is what it looks like. I sent you to Burma with 2 of my best armies, and you walked out with 2 of my squads, because in this total party of a little over 100, there are 18 Chinese. He's not with a Chinese unit as big as a battalion, much less a regiment, a division, or whatever. So from Chiang's standpoint, this has been a disaster at multiple levels. He's he thinks very carefully about whether he wants to demand the relief of Joseph Stilwell. He's dissuaded from doing this because he interprets correctly that General George Marshall stands rock solid with Stilwell, and his wife also persuades him that Stilwell is a good guy, or whatever here. So he hangs on with Stilwell, and that's the end of the Burma campaign. Now let me conclude by talking about what China actually achieved, not only for itself, but for the whole world during this period. The conventional view about China's contributions to World War II has emphasized that basically they tied down an awful lot of Japanese. At various points, the number of Japanese in China went from 600,000 or so and up to 1 million and down to 700,000 or whatever, back up to about 1 million by the end of the war. And obviously that those Japanese soldiers in China during that period could not be making mischief elsewhere against the Americans, the Soviets, or anyone else. Beyond that, the Chinese have not been given a great deal of credit for their contribution during World War II. I think there's a different way to look at this. Let's imagine, for instance, that China drops out of the war before 1941. What happens in the war? Well, for one thing, without the Japanese tied down in China, they're available to join the Germans in the attack on the Soviet Union in June of 1941, which raises sort of interesting what-ifs about how that comes out. But a lot more important than that is this. Without the slightest shadow of a doubt, it is the war in China which is going to be the cause, the overwhelming cause for why the U.S. comes into World War II. The road to Pearl Harbor leads through China. There's a wonderful quote by, oh, I'm sorry, I missed over. I should point out that not only during these air raids did the Japanese kill a lot of Chinese people, the images of what's going on in China at this time are going to have a very powerful effect on the U.S., and maybe in the Q&A we can talk about that a little bit. David Kennedy, a historian I very much admire. I know he's a very sound guy. He thinks my work is good. And in his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, he has this wonderful quote that tells you basically that it's the war in China that's going to lead down to Pearl Harbor. And that if it's not for China hanging in the war, it's extraordinarily difficult to imagine how it is that the U.S. in fact gets into the war. And even more important than the fact that the U.S. gets in the war is something else that Pearl Harbor does, because Pearl Harbor is the event which resolves conclusively all of this enormous internal divide within the U.S. about whether to get into the war or not. The anti-interventionists versus the interventionists, or so-called isolationists or whatever here, and their battles through 1941. All of this goes away instantly with the attack on Pearl Harbor. So it not only brings the U.S. into the war, but brings the U.S. not only as a nation, but as a people, united in the notion that they will see the war through to a decisive finish. If China doesn't hang into the war, how do we get to this point? How do we get not only to the U.S. getting into the war, but the U.S. getting into the war with the resolve to pursue it through in the manner in which the war was done? There's a wonderful quote, which, believe me, it's there. Apparently not there. Well, I thought I had it. There's a wonderful quote in Time magazine that's published immediately after the attack on Pearl Harbor. And in that article, the Time magazine says that Pearl Harbor describes it as sort of an earthquake in reverse, that everything was loose, disjointed, in conflict, suddenly is brought back together and unified in this one stroke. And that's what happens at Pearl Harbor, and that's what happens because China's war of resistance and the Chinese hanging in the war and not quitting in this period that we don't think about and have not thought about for a long time that I've talked to you about tonight. So with that, we'll do some Q&A.